Before we begin, this is your one and only spoiler warning. There is a scene, depending on how far we get into the recorded gameplay, that has to do with the story. So if you don't want to know anything, you can still treat this video as a podcast. You don't really have to look at what's happening on the screen. You can just play it and listen to it, and that's fine. Hi, I don't know how to open this video. I thought about a few different ways to open this. I was going to talk a little bit about a different topic, not really having to do with Soulstice the game, but I'm not going to do that. I think I'll save that for a different video if I choose to make that. But my name is Spencer, and I made a short about Soulstice probably 2.5 years ago or something like that. And it is still my most viewed short or video that I've ever done. It has consistently gotten views for years. I have no idea why that is. I don't know why it went off that much compared to other videos I've made. But I played the demo and I thought, okay, this looks promising. At some point soon, at the time, I thought I'll make a video about this because it looks promising. And I think that there's more here. And I was under the impression that this was the kind of game that would fly under the radar. And I think that it mostly has. I don't recall seeing, and this shouldn't be the metric, and it's not the singular metric for this, but I don't remember seeing a lot of bigger streamers like on Twitch streaming this game. I haven't really seen a lot of people talk about this game. I wasn't looking that hard when it came out, but this just seems like a competent mid-tier game. And I understand that in the current zeitgeist, mid means negative mostly. But that's not how I'm using it. It's a mid-tier game in that it has clearly money behind it, but it's not a Call of Duty. It's not an Assassin's Creed. It's not whatever. It's not a big AAA, I'm doing air quotes, AAA game. But it's competently made. And I've been debating about how critical of this game I want to be, because the combat, for the most part, is the thing that I have the most complaints with. Everything else, I really like. I think the atmosphere is very well done. I like the graphical style. I don't really know what you would call this. It's semi-realistic. It's got like a stylized sort of look to it. It's definitely not cel shaded like Borderlands, but it does have like an artistic kind of flair to it. The way the characters look, the way the environments look. And I like that. The lighting is really good too. I've taken a number of screenshots, maybe I'll throw them on the screen here, that look gorgeous. And I've stopped a number of times when I go into an area and there's no combat, and I don't pause the game, but I just let the main character, Briar, her name is Briar, and her sister Loot. I won't spoil too much, but their souls are connected to each other, basically. You should play the game yourself and find out. Even though I'm going to be kind of negative about the game. But I pause sometimes and just to look at these environments because they look so nice. The effects are nice, the lighting is nice, the atmosphere is nice. And I enjoy that. I think that maybe a lot of people go through games and they just go from one place to another and play it, and they don't really stop to look at it. I've stopped to really look at this game a number of times. So I have a lot of praise for the art direction of the game. And let me make sure I shout out the studio and name them properly. This game is developed by Reply Game Studios. And you did a good job. Legitimately. You did a nice job. I want there to be more games like this. I hope that... I mean, they could make this a franchise. I don't really want them to, because I'm more of a fan of one-off games where I don't have to be invested in a whole series. Not that a series of games is bad, but one-offs are nice. I feel the same way about movies too. One-offs are fine. I don't need a franchise out of everything. But I hope that they continue to develop new IPs, unique IPs, and can make great games with them. I sincerely hope for that. The story of the game is fine. It's perfectly serviceable. The basic premise is that you are playing as Briar, who is connected to her sister's soul, Lute. They are a chimera. They have a special connection with another soul. They're very strong, and they are used and sent to different areas to get rid of monsters, basically. There's like this other world, I forget what it's called, where like the monsters live, and there's a tear in like the fabric of reality directly over this town called Ilden, I think. And a bunch of monsters are coming out of there. There's like corruption spreading everywhere. So they send in 3 chimeras to deal with it. Actually, I think 4. No, actually, I think 5. Because there were 2 that went in initially. They perished, apparently. And then 3 more were sent in. You, Briar, another one named Donovan, and then the third, who I think died or is missing or something. But the whole story is you making your way from the outskirts of the city further in towards the tear that's like right in the middle and closing it. And it's suspected that there's some sort of foul play going on. Things don't quite add up right. The tear is opened, and yet the government of this world seems to be complacent in trying to close it, or maybe wants it to be open. It's not quite clear. I haven't finished the game, but it's interesting enough. The biggest problem that I have with the game is the combat. I thought what was happening here was that this was going to be, because this reminded me of the old PlayStation 2 God of War games. Those games had a fixed camera angle that you didn't directly control the camera. You can move it around a little bit in Soulstice to get a better view of what's happening, but the position that the camera is in, it is where it is. You can only pan it a little bit to look at the environment a little more. But that was giving me PlayStation 2 God of War vibes. And I love those games. I played those games when I was younger. I had a great time with them. I love them. And the other thing I thought this was going to be more like is something like Devil May Cry. I don't have a lot of experience with Devil May Cry. I played a bit of the first game, and I played a bit of Devil May Cry 5, I think. There was something about the combat in that game that I didn't love. I don't remember what it was. I should probably go back and play it, because I think I would still like it. But in Devil May Cry and in God of War, quite honestly, there's a bit more depth to the combat. You have different types of weapons in those games, and you have different types of weapons here. The problem is that the weapons that you have in Soulstice are mostly useless, other than your main two weapons, and are only useful in certain situations or for certain things. So, for example, your main two weapons are a sword and a hammer, and they're actually the same weapon. You can hit with a sword, and then that same sword transforms into a hammer that you can bash things with. Those are your main two. Those are the weapons that I use most of the time. There's a few more that you can use. There is a gauntlet type weapon with like spikes on it that it's very short range, but it's good at taking off armor from enemies. And that's basically all that it's good for. It doesn't seem like it does a lot more damage than other weapons. It's just good for that one thing. Oh, there's an armored enemy. Take out the glove. Hit that enemy until the armor falls off. Then you can go back to using the sword and hammer. And there's a whip, like a serrated whip kind of weapon. And I read the codex at one point that describes what the weapon does. And I think it has, well, all the weapons have a damage bonus to certain types of enemies. The whip does, and I think it's better against enemies called swarmers, but I don't actually know which enemies are swarmers. It seems to work pretty well against some of the flying enemies that you'll see in here that you have to use that blue force field in order to hit. I'll get into that later. And I don't know about the damage, but it's mostly useful because if you have a bunch of flying enemies, you can hit a lot of them all at once because it's got a big area that it hits. It's a whip, of course. Of course, you can hit a lot of things. It's a whip. Just think about how a whip works. You can spin it around and hit a bunch of enemies. And then there is a bow and arrow, which I think does bonus damage to just flying enemies or something. And I've used that a few times, but for the most part, I forget that the bow exists, that not so much the whip, because I actually use that, and not so much the gauntlet weapon, because I do use that. But you can get through the whole game just by using the sword and hammer. You don't have to use all those other weapons. And that's the problem, is that you would only use the gauntlet for one reason, for armor. It doesn't do anything else. You can unlock a few different abilities and moves for some of these weapons, but most of it is just the same stuff. So, for example, with the hammer, you can do, I forget what it is. I think it's X and A. If you hit X and A at the same time, you'll use the hammer and knock an enemy up into the air, and then you also jump up with that enemy and can hit them in the air. And then I think every other weapon, except the sword, but the gauntlet, the whip, the bow, they all do that same move. It's just done with that particular weapon. And it's the same button press too. It's X and A on the controller. I'm using an Xbox controller. They do the same thing. It is functionally the same attack, except with the whip instead of the glove, the gauntlet, whatever. So, other than, doing more damage to armor or whatever, you don't have a reason to use the weapons. They don't have different move sets. There's no combos. Actually, that's not true. There's one combo that you will use throughout the entire game if you want to. I don't think it's that useful. But it is this. XX, pause, XXX. Or if you're using the other weapon, I think that one's for the hammer. If you want to use that for the sword, it's YY, pause, YYY. Those are your two combos for the entire game. And in fact, they're one and the same combo, basically. It's just pressing X instead of Y, or Y instead of X. That's it. And that's one of my biggest complaints about this game is I thought there would be combos. I thought there would be different moves that you could do. You could like grab enemies and swing them around and like push them against a wall or something like that. But no, it's this one combo. And there's a few other little moves like knocking enemies into the air. Or, well, speaking of knocking enemies into the air, I thought there would be legitimate juggling of enemies, like there is in Devil May Cry, right? And it's almost there if the way the move worked for the whip weapon was different. So you can knock enemies into the air with a few different weapons, and that's fine. And then you can go up there and hit them around, that's fine too. With the whip, how this one of the moves works is that you basically you hit the enemy, and I guess the chain like wraps around the enemy or something, and then you pull Briar to the enemy. So picture this. You can knock an enemy into the air. You're hitting them. You target a different enemy. And then instead of using the whip to grab that enemy and pull them up towards you so that you can continue juggling enemies in the air, you get brought back down to the ground. Unless, of course, you're fighting a bunch of flying enemies and can hop between them. But that would be the only case where you can legitimately stay up in the air and juggle enemies. Or at least hop between enemies. You're not really juggling because they're flying enemies anyway. You juggle by taking enemies that would normally be on the ground and pulling them up towards you and staying in the air to hit them. That's really not possible in this game. Even though at the end of combat, you've probably seen it, but you get a score at the end of each combat. I think there's 3 different scores. You can get a basically like bronze to platinum or diamond score for each of them. One is for how much damage you take. One is for how much time you spend in combat. The less time you spend in combat, the higher the score. And then there's basically just your score for that combat. And the way to boost the score essentially is to just switch between weapons constantly. That way you can build up a score. Right? It doesn't reward doing combos or doing anything interesting. It's just switch weapons constantly to build up the score. But on the right-hand side of the screen, there will be little, I don't know what you would call them, accolades or names of different things about how you scored. There's like juggler or no hits or whatever it is. But like, there's no explanation for what each of those mean. You have to just sort of guess. Okay, why did I get, whatever it is, whatever the name of the accolade is. I don't know why I got it. I don't know what exactly I did in combat. You just have to look at those little accolades and try to figure out what do those mean? What did you do in combat? What could that possibly mean? So it's not clear why I'm scoring the way that I'm scoring. I'm just mashing buttons, basically. That's all I really do with the combat is I mash X, I mash Y, and sometimes I switch to different weapons and then the score goes up. And that's really it. There's not really any thought to it. It's just button mash, switch between weapons, good score. And that's all. And that brings me to the force fields. I don't know what else to call them. But there's a red one and there's a blue one. And oftentimes in combat, you will have a mix of different types of enemies. Some are just normal enemies. You just hit them with the sword and they die, right? Other enemies you will see, it's mostly the flying enemies. You have to use the blue force field in order to reveal those enemies, and then you can hit them. Because if you're not using the blue force field, you can't hit them. They're essentially invincible. And the same is for the red force field. You'll encounter enemies in combat who have like these red crystals on them. It's a very clear indicator. You have to use that red force field in order to make them vulnerable and hit them. Because if you try to hit them without using that, you just won't do any damage to them. In theory, mixing the different types of enemies like that would be interesting. The only problem is you don't have to use different strategies for different types of enemies. Not really. All you have to do is use the right force field, walk up to them, and mash the X button, and that's really it. That's really the entire game. And it's the same with the bosses, quite honestly. The bosses are extremely boring and just uninteresting. The first boss I came across in the game was one of the ones that had the red crystals on it. And I spent most of that boss fight just running towards the boss so I could hit them once or twice, and then they would teleport. And on top of that, and I have to use that red force field when I'm hitting them. So if I run up to them and I forget to turn on the force field, I'll just do no damage, and then they teleport a long ways away, and I gotta run all the way over to them and hit them again. On top of that, and this is not the only boss fight that does this, and I hate this. I hate when games do this. If you happen to watch another video that I put out, and you probably didn't because nobody watched this video, on a game called Inversion. Inversion did this too, where you don't just get the boss, you get a bunch of other lesser enemies that the game throws at you during a boss fight. So it's not just the boss that you're fighting, it's all these other enemies. And I think that fucking sucks. Nothing says this is a bullshit boss design than put the boss in there and then throw a bunch of other cannon fodder in there. Because we can't come up with a boss that has a decent moveset and is interesting to fight. Just throw a bunch of crap in there with the boss. And that's the boss fight. I hate that. That is such lazy design. And I think every boss has been like that. They've all had cannon fodder thrown in to the boss arena along with the boss. And in particular with the first boss, like I said, I was mostly just running. Enemies will, when they attack you, you have the option to press the B button, and that can do a number of things. That can freeze an enemy midway through their attack, and when they get unfrozen, they will follow through and still do the entire attack. So that you're not stopping it. You're just freezing them so you can move out of the way. Even though most of the time you don't actually need to do that freeze, you can just move out of the way. Like the freeze is unnecessary. Other times, and I'd have to look this up, but I'm not going to because I don't care that much. Other times, when you press the B button, it won't freeze the enemy midway through its animation. Sometimes it will completely disrupt the attack. I think it depends on the type of enemy that it is. I think it's like if it's a minor enemy, they get disrupted. And with major enemies, like larger enemies, they don't get disrupted. They get frozen or something like that. Or maybe it's like a timing thing if you button press it just the right time. Because I think they mentioned that the timing of the button press is important. I don't remember. But it's something like that. The timing of the type of enemy determines like what it is that you do. You freeze them, or you completely disrupt their attack, or you like hold them in place. It's not the same as the freezing. They just like stop moving, basically. And it might cancel the attack. I don't remember what it does. But it's just, if I can go back to the combo for a minute as well, that combo, it's not a long string of button presses, but given how quickly the combat moves and how many different enemies are going to be on the screen all at once, and different types of enemies that are flying or on the ground and do different kinds of attacks, you don't have time to do that combo. And the combo, as far as I can tell, that XX, pause, XXX, it doesn't do like a lot of extra damage. It's not like a special move. It's just, I honestly think you would be better off just continuously mashing the X button or the Y button, and it would be functionally the same thing. The combo itself is not interesting, and well, I suppose there's a use case for it. You've probably noticed in combat in the upper right-hand corner, there's an image of Briar and Lute. That is an indicator of their unity. And if you build up their unity high enough that, the bars fill, their pictures fill in, when you do that combo, it will produce a more special move that I think actually does do extra damage. And if you get certain upgrades after you do that combo, Lute will send out extra, like, not beams, but like projectiles to hit enemies after that combo is done. And I think I've only successfully done that like twice in the entire game. Mostly because it's really hard to build unity unless, of course, you're constantly switching between weapons and making sure that you do not get hit. Because if you get hit, you lose a lot of unity. Even when you get the upgrades to lessen the amount of unity that you lose when you get hit. The other thing that can happen when you reach a certain point in the game is that you can, and I guess this is a minor spoiler, but if a chimera kind of gives in to the power that is within them, like I forget what they call it, chaos or corruption or whatever inside of them, they can partially transcend, which I'm sure you've noticed is that like purple effect that happens. You can reach that state when your unity is high enough. Now that is actually very useful because that is really powerful. And entering that like slightly transcended state, that does a lot of damage. You can't switch weapons when you're in that state. You just use the sword, but you can eviscerate enemies very quickly. There's also another mode, what I call it, mode state of transcendence, where Briar can go berserk. I think that only happens at certain points in the story where she is still in that like mode where she's doing a lot of damage, but you, the player, don't have any control over her. And it takes controlling Lute, who's in like kind of a dream sequence area, to progress through there and bring her out of that berserk mode. So you don't actually get to play the game in berserk mode. It's just like a thing that happens automatically, and then you're forced into a section where you have to play Lute, which I don't have any complaints about playing as Lute, even though the sections where you play as Lute are not super interesting from a gameplay standpoint. It's mostly just, well, that would be a spoiler, but there's no real combat when you play as Lute. And I can't quite get to everything, I don't think, because I don't want this video to drag on for too long. But it feels like there's a lot of throwaway mechanics in this game. For example, you'll notice these red crystals that are around. Some of them are on the floor, some of them are on the wall. Others are completely blocking a doorway, right? Early on in the game, you can use the red force field, walk up to crystals that are blocking a doorway, and just break it. That's fine. Later on in the game, you will find crystals that are blocking doors, and then there are other smaller red crystals like what you're seeing on the screen now that you have to hit and destroy before you can go hit the big one that's blocking the door. Okay, sure. That adds a little bit more traversal. You got to move around and hit other things. And you'll also notice that now on the ground, there are those red highlighted areas. Those are like chaos ruptures. And so if you stand over them for too long with that red force field up, they will explode and damage you. So then the game started putting those around those smaller crystals that you have to hit. So basically now there's a time limit on how much you can hit that smaller crystal. They do get destroyed pretty quickly, but it just seems like an unnecessary addition. Like it's just annoying. I can't just walk up to this crystal, throw up the red force field and destroy it. Now I got to worry about the ground exploding so I can hit it like once or twice, turn off the force field, wait for those ruptures to kind of dissipate, and then turn the force field back on, and then continue hitting the crystal until it breaks. It just seems so unnecessary and annoying. And it's especially annoying because this has happened a few times where you enter into a combat area where you have those chaos ruptures. So using the red force field would be dangerous, and they throw these chaos corrupted enemies with the red crystals on them into combat along with other types of enemies, normal enemies, and the enemies that you have to use the blue force field in order to hit. And I haven't even mentioned that with the blue force field, there's also another environmental element that if you don't use the blue force field, there's like these blue spiky balls that float around in the air. And if you don't use the blue force field, they'll explode and damage you. So there have been times, I think once, maybe, where I was in a combat area and I had corrupted enemies with the red crystals. and I had the blue flying enemies, wraiths, I think they're called, wraiths. I had those to deal with, and I had normal enemies. So already that's a lot. Then they throw in the chaos ruptures on the ground so that I can't use the red force field in order to hit the enemies for too long. Otherwise, those will explode, so I have to turn that on and off. And they have the blue spiky balls around as well, so I have to turn on the blue force field every once in a while, or actually very often, to make sure that those don't explode in my face and do damage to me. And so I can actually hit the enemies with each of those force fields. And you have to be careful not to use the force fields for too long, because in the upper left-hand corner when you're in combat, there's a little circular area that is your entropy. And if you use the force fields for too long, that fills up, and then Loot has to disappear for a few seconds before she can come back. In the meantime, you can't use the force fields. You can't hit those enemies that require the force fields to hit them. And it just becomes a jumbled mess. You have all of this crap that you have to deal with force fields and environmental hazards and all these different types of enemies. And it's like they're trying to make the combat complex and interesting, and it's just annoying. It's not like there are different types of enemies with different move sets where you have to do different things with them, use different combos, or you switch to a different weapon that legitimately has use for those particular types of enemies and other things within the environment. It's just more stuff. They've just thrown in as much stuff as possible and are like, ooh, it's a complex combat system. No, it's just annoying. Despite all of that, despite how upsetting this makes me, the combat does, and how frustrating it is, how shallow I think it is, a lack of actual moves that you can do, and it's more just dealing with a bunch of annoying mechanics for different types of enemies. I still recommend that you play this game. I still recommend that you give this developer money, because, you know, there's a lot of complaints about, a lot of like gotcha games that are coming out, a lot of microtransactions, a lot of gambling in games, a lot of AAA, I'm doing the air quotes again, AAA games that just don't deliver, or that have microtransactions in them, and people are not happy about it. I'm looking at you a little bit, Dragon's Dogma 2, even though I've played Dragon's Dogma 2 and I actually legitimately think that it's a pretty good game. I can make a video about that another time. But I want more of these sort of mid-tier games. Games that are perfectly serviceable, that are not going to set the world on fire, that despite what some nerds might say about it online, about how, oh, Soulstice is awful, it's really not very good at all. And you know the ones you see, like the Steam reviews of people being like, let's break down the whole, a whole review for the game. I've got a different section for graphics and sound and all this kind of stuff, and they're like being very analytical about it or whatever, and I'm like, brother, nobody's gonna fucking read through this Steam review except other nerds that are just there for like confirmation bias, like, oh yeah, it is a negative game, that's what I want to hear. I want I want more games like this. I want new IPs. I want things that are not a part of a franchise. I want things that are just pretty good, that are just a pretty solid game. It's not being super ambitious. It's not awful, as I said some nerds online will say that it is. It's not awful at all. And if you think this is awful, dear God, my boy, go browsing on the Steam page, on the store page, and look at recently releasing and the ton of garbage games that come out every single day. Get one of those and play them and see how bad they are, and then come back to a game like Soulstice and tell me with a straight face, looking in my eyes, Soulstice is a bad game. It's not very good. It's very, mid in like a bad way. Not mid like the way I mean it, where it's medium. I guess medium is a better description. You can have indie games, you can have big AAA games, and then you can have medium games that have more of a budget than an indie game, less of a budget than a AAA game, but there's like a happy medium. I want more of that. And studios like Reply Game Studios, it's great to have companies making games like this. It would be even better to have more of them. It would be even better to have big companies, Activision, Ubisoft, EA, Blizzard, others, whoever else, making these types of games. I know why they don't do it, because they don't want to take any risks. They don't want to make a game that won't sell. They just rely on franchise IPs. Let's make another Assassin's Creed game. Let's make another Call of Duty. Let's make Overwatch 2, and then it's not any different than the first Overwatch. We just wanted to sell another game to you for no reason, and now you can't play the original Overwatch anymore for whatever reason, even though Overwatch 2 doesn't actually add anything interesting or new. It's just Overwatch 1, but get rid of the 1 and put a 2 on the end. So I've already forgotten if I've said this already. But it bears repeating. It's worth repeating. If you want more games like this, these sort of medium sort of games in terms of budget and ambition and stuff like that, you have to buy this or any other game like this. You have to spend time on this. You can't wait for that perfect game to come out, that like medium, mid-tier game that isn't setting the world on fire but does everything right, and oh, it's criminal. This is a hidden gem that people aren't talking about. More people should play this. What a shame. You can't wait for that mid-tier game to be a hidden gem. You gotta, if you're interested in what the game's doing on some level, which I am interested in what this game is doing, you gotta buy it. And even with all the flaws, even with all the complaining that I just did about the combat specifically, if you remember, at the beginning of the video, I was giving the game quite a bit of praise for the visuals, the art style, and the lighting, and the atmosphere of the game. And I didn't say this earlier, but despite my feelings of the combat being pretty boring and a lot of throwaway mechanics and just more complexity thrown in there for complexity's sake, the combat still feels nice. It feels nice to hit things with my giant hammer. It feels nice to slash enemies with the sword. They did a good job on how the combat feels, the actual kinetics of hitting things. That's well done. But I will go to bat for this game, despite my complaining. because I want more games like this. If you want games like this, you have to spend money and time on them. I know I've said that multiple times, but people need the repetition. You've got to spend your money and time on games like this if you want more of it. If you keep going back to the same AAA games, keep buying those despite how you hate them or how you say that you hate them, and buy the microtransactions and buy the loot boxes and do all this stuff, you're going to get more of it. That's why they keep doing that shit. Why do you think they still have microtransactions in games? Because they fucking work. Because people buy them. Despite all of the complaining that people do, I hate microtransactions. I don't want them in games. A lot of people still buy them anyway. Probably not the majority. There's probably a wide array of people who do a microtransaction like once, and then you get your prototypical whales, air quotes again, whales, who just spend all the microtransactions, all the loot boxes, all the everything, all the extras that they can buy. They buy them all, despite whatever quality level those things might be. And I'm just now realizing I've used the word despite way too many times. I'm very sorry. I keep using that word. All of that is to say, I recommend Soulstice. I recommend games like this because I want more of them. And we don't have to completely rely on indie games, pixel graphics for all the innovation. It doesn't have to be just that. That's all I got. Thank you for watching.